Hello friends! Today we are going to do a Fight Caves companion guide. This one is going to really just break down the Fight Caves. It's probably going to be a longer one, so I am going to break it up into subsections and then release the entire thing as kind of one big episode. We'll probably break it down into an overview, gear, recs, requirements, plugins, all of that kind of stuff. And then the second part will go through all of the monsters and kind of what the Fight Caves looks like. And the last section we will do will be on Jad specifically. So I will break this down into multiple different sections to make things a little bit easier. And then obviously put it all together if you want to watch the whole thing. So that's kind of the game plan for this. There is a lot to cover because, there's a few different components in the Fight Caves, and I want to be as detailed as possible. So if you don't need to know about the monsters and you're just curious about Jad, I would just say head over to that one. I think for each of these episodes, I will link the other ones all in the description, and then, break down the whole thing for you. So make it as easy as possible so that Jad can be beaten. Get that fire cape, right? That's the whole point. So moving into recommendations, I do recommend, if possible, to do this on a Slayer task. It is going to help significantly with beating Jad because you'll get some extra DPS. Now, I understand if that's not totally possible, so it is just a recommendation. However, if you can do it on Slayer task, it is highly worth doing on Slayer task. In terms of other recommendations, I do recommend the Fight Helper plugin. So if you have Runelite, there are a couple of plugins that I'm going to go through here that are going to make doing this a lot easier. The first one is the Fight Cave Helper. You'll notice on the right hand side of my screen I have a little mini map of the Fight Caves. The Fight Cave Helper is going to be fantastic because it's going to help you to determine a couple of things. The first thing is going to be where Jad's going to spawn. So basically when you first start the Fight Caves, you're going to input the first two wave locations of the bats. Once you have input the first two wave locations of the bats, it's going to then spit out all of the locations of the rest of the monsters throughout the fight. This is important, one, for knowing where Jad is going to spawn, but two, you can then strategize through every wave as you go along. It becomes super important later on when you're fighting the Magers and you have Rangers and you have Meleers and you have all these different monsters kind of going on. If you know where they're going to spawn, it can help you to figure out where you should position yourself on the map. For me, at my level, I literally just stand in the middle and I tank most of the stuff the whole way through. But when you're fighting earlier on, especially if you're a lower level, you really want to take advantage of Italy Rock. Italy Rock is this little rock over here on the eastern side of the cave. If you use that, you can pin a lot of monsters up against it and then reduce the damage that you take. So just by knowing where they're going to spawn, it will help you determine which side of Italy Rock you should be standing on, and then you can create a bit of distance between yourself and the monsters and save on some much needed prayer pots. So positioning is important. The Fight Cave Helper is going to help you do that, as well as knowing at the very end where Jad's going to be so that you can strategize where you need to be. Ideally, if you're not doing this on task, I would just say enter and exit the cave until you get the wave setup that you want. The ideal location for Jad is going to be in this southeast area here because it's going to force all of his healers to spawn in other corners, which is going to keep them off of him for longer and give you some extra time to hopefully tag them before they get to Jad and start healing him. So ideally, if you can fit him somewhere in this southeast corner around Italy Rock, that's going to be your best bet. I kill Jad wherever he spawns. It literally makes no difference to me. So, if you're more advanced, you can just, wherever Jad spawns, just kill him and you'll know where he is. But earlier on, I'd say if you're not on task and you're trying to get your cape, I would recommend just going in and out of the cave until you get the Jad spawn that you want. And once you have the Jad spawn that you want, then proceed with the Fight Caves. Another incredibly useful plugin is going to be the NPC Indicators plugin. Now, once you add it, you'll go into settings and then type in the mini healers for Jad. The reason that I recommend that you do this is because it will tag them. Mine is a blue highlight, but you can change it to whatever color you want. It will tag them in that highlight color and makes them much easier to see. When you're in the fight caves, everything's kind of black and orange, and the healers are wearing dark black robes, so they kind of blend in. They're so tiny and you may not actually see them all, so this will highlight them on your screen, make it much easier for you to see them, tag them, and get them off of Jad before, you know, they heal him too much. So another super useful plugin that I would recommend. The only other thing to do and to note is that if Jad is somewhere you don't want him to be, what I recommend that you do is drag the orange major at the end on the 60-second wave. So kill the red one first, and then go and find a spot where you want to be optimally so that when Jad spawns, you're safe. So in this particular example, because Jad's going to spawn in the south here, I would drag the orange major all the way up over here and down into this corner, and then kill it. This is going to leave me on the northern side of Italy Rock, and it's going to mean that Jad spawns here. Jad will automatically tuck down into this corner, which means that I'll have a separation point between myself and Jad. That's going to give me a small break to breathe before I actually fight him. So that gives you time to eat, pot up, make sure everything is ready to go, and to calm your nerves. Because, you know, the first time you fight Jad, there's going to be a ton of anxiety. You're going to be like really amped up, and you're going to be shaking and messing stuff up, and that's what's going to cause you to lose the fight. So just by having a chance to take a minute, you're going to have a much better run through of the Jad scenario. So I do recommend on the 60-second wave to drag that orange mage. If he had spawned down here, I would drag him up into this corner because I know Jad's going to spawn here. Same thing if he's over here, I'm going to drag him down into this corner. Basically put one of these big pillars between yourself and Jad so that when he spawns, you have a few extra minutes to just calm down, get yourself set up, make sure you're full health, make sure your prayer's good, and then you'll be good to go. Why is Jad considered difficult? Jad's really not that hard. If you think about it, it's probably an easier boss. I know it sounds ridiculous if you're having struggle and while we're watching this, you're probably like, well, what do you mean? Jad is super hard, but you actually have a tremendous amount of time between your prayer switches. You've got lots and lots of time, if you really think about it, to make your switch. So just be calm when you're fighting Jad, and remember, even if you have to fight through the caves again, it might take you an hour, maybe a little longer depending on your level, and I think that's why most people panic when they get to Jad. It's not necessarily fighting Jad, it's that you've had to go through all of this other stuff to actually get to Jad. If you just walked down the fight caves and you got to fight Jad over and over and over again, it would probably lose that scary feeling pretty quick, but it's just because you've had to go through so much work to actually get to Jad. Maybe you're low on food, you're low on prayer pots, and a little bit of that panic starts to set in. So just remember, have fun. Fight caves is a good time. I really enjoy it. It's one of my favorite things. I always do it on Slayer Task. If you're having difficulty, it's not that Jad is hard, it's that you're probably just panicking and maybe reading too much into the situation. So try and relax. You're going to beat it. You're going to get your fire cape. Moving into the gear and requirements. So we'll talk about the requirements that I would recommend first. Ideally for this fight, I use the blowpipe. I highly recommend that you have a blowpipe for this battle. It's going to make everything significantly easier. The blowpipe is fast, it's got short range, but it takes care of the monsters pretty effectively, and it will most likely poison them along the way, which is going to increase your DPS. So I highly recommend the blowpipe. In order to use that, you're going to need 75 plus range. The next hard requirement is going to be a minimum of 40 defense. The reason that you're going to need 40 defense is because at the very least you should be wearing a set of blessed D-hide. If you're not killing this on task, I do highly recommend at the very least having the blessed D-hide and an blessed coif. That's going to keep you safe. The blessed D-hide is going to extend your prayer, and that's going to be sort of the minimum hard requirement for defense, is to have a blessed D-hide set. On the prayer side of things, the lowest requirement I would recommend is 44 prayer. The reason I recommend 44 prayer is because you want to at the very least have Eagle Eye. Eagle Eye's unlocked at level 44, and you want access to all of the Protect from prayer spells. So Protect from melee, ranged, and magic is critical on this. You cannot do this fight without those, so I'd say the hard requirement for prayer is 44. Ideally, level 74 plus is going to make this exceptionally easier. Rigor just hits way harder. It's much superior to the Eagle Eye prayer because it not only buffs your ranged, but it's also going to give you a little bit of extra defense, which is going to help with the later on stages of the fight. So if possible, level 74. The other reason that that's important is because if you have more prayer, it's going to drastically reduce the amount of prayer pots that you need for the fight, and it's going to make everything a little bit easier in terms of knowing when to use your prayer and when not to. Like, I typically bring a ton of prayer pots with me in there, and I always have left over because my prayer is higher at level 77. The other thing too is when you have higher prayer, every sip of prayer pot that you take is going to give you more prayer, so you actually will increase the amount of prayer as well as the duration. So having higher prayer for this fight is going to matter. I'd say the minimum requirement is going to be that 44 though. On the gear side of things, I have a budget setup and then I have a more expensive setup, and I'll run you through them both. So on the budget side of things, this one's going to come in at around 10 mil. I always like to have a budget setup because if you don't, it's going to be, you know, it might be hard. Maybe you don't have access to all of the, you know, the GP that you need. So the budget gear setup I have on the screen now is going to come in right around 10 mil for you. On this setup, we'll go through everything that's here. I've got a set of Blessed D'hide. I am rocking the Blowpipe, which I highly recommend. An Amulet of Fury. We've got the Ava's Accumulator. Armadale Coif. If you're doing this on Slayer task, put on the Slayer helm. Make sure that your Slayer helm is imbued, or if you're not using a Slayer helm, a black mask that is imbued. Otherwise you won't get the range bonus and it's pointless to wear while you're in there. Archer's Ring, highly recommend. Barrow's Gloves or your next in slot, you know, if you don't have Barrow's Gloves, Dragon Gloves, and then all the way down Rune, etc. And then, you know, that's pretty much it on the budget side of gears. This, like I say, costs about 10 mil, so it's not massively breaking the bank. It's pretty reasonable in terms of its overall costs, but it is going to help you with getting through the fight. So I would say this is kind of your base setup recommendation. Like I say, coming in around 10 mil. And then, of course, your weapon for the Jad fight that I recommend, I use a crystal bow at the minimum. I actually use Venator bows now, but I'll walk through why I use this. So the reason that I swap out on the Jad fight is not to kill Jad. I literally only switch this out for the healers. This just gives me an extra bit of range to tag the healers without getting close to Jad, because if you have the Blowpipe and the healers are on the backside of Jad and you try and shoot them, you're going to step into Jad's melee range and Jad is going to one-hit you. So having the crystal bow and setting it up so that it's in long range will allow you to hit the healers from pretty much anywhere because you have a 10-tile range, and that's just going to save you from getting too close to Jad by accident. So I switch out when the healers come, tag all the healers, switch back to my Blowpipe, and then finish off Jad. So that's the only reason I carry this extra weapon with me. If you are using the Blowpipe, it just doesn't have the range, so you can just use the Blowpipe and just run around Jad, but I prefer to have something a little more long range for taking on the healers. So this is my gear setup 1. Like I say, it's going to come in around 10 mil depending on prices when you watch this video, but it's not going to be breaking the bank, and you can definitely beat Jad with this setup. I beat Jad the first time with this exact setup here: Blowpipe, D'hide, Fury, Slayer helm, the Accumulator, Archer's Ring, the D'hide boots, and then my Barrow's Gloves and my crystal bow to tag the healers. So yeah, the other advantage with the crystal bow is you don't actually need any ammunition here, so you can rock a Rada's Blessing or another blessed prayer bonus in the ranged arrow slot. So moving into setup number 2, this one's going to be quite a bit more expensive. Ideally, if you have the money, like Armadil or Missouri is going to be your best in slot here. A Necklace of Anguish is going to be massive. I use a Robin Hood hat if I'm not on task, which I rarely am. If I'm on task, this will be replaced with the Slayer helm. We've got dragon arrows. If you can use dragon arrows, I would highly recommend. I've got the Ava's Assembler, and then my D'hide boots you could swap out for Pegasus. Archer's Ring imbued, and then Barrow's Gloves. If you have the money and the ability, you could upgrade these to Ferocious. You could change this out to Missouri. These could be Pegasus, like I say, and that would give you much better DPS. Now, on the Blowpipe Note, you can charge and load the Blowpipe with Zulrah Scales and darts. Now, I use dragon darts, but they are quite expensive, so if you can't use dragon darts, again, you can go down. I used rune darts the first time that I beat Jad, so rune darts will work just fine, and then amethyst, and then if you have the money, use the dragon darts. You also don't need to fully charge the blowpipe. You can use around 3k scales, which is going to be tons, so you don't have to charge it with the 16,000 scales and have it full. About 3,000 charges is going to get you through the fight caves probably a few times, and then around 1,000 darts will also get you through the fight, depending on your range level and the DPS that you can pump out. So, you know, if you're using rune darts, I would say get like 2,000 just to be safe, and then go for like 3,000 or 4,000 Zulrah scales. But if you're a little bit higher up, you can probably do 3,000 Zulrah scales and 1,000 of whatever dart that you so choose. If you are worried about the GP side of things, maybe just go get a little bit more GP before you take them on and get up to that 2,000 darts and like 4,000 or 5,000 scales. Last thing you want to do is run out of ammo at Jad and then have to redo the whole fight cave. So now the last thing to talk about is going to be your inventory setup. Now this is going to range a little bit for everybody depending on what it is that they're bringing into the fight and their levels and requirements, so this is not a hard you should do this exactly as I do. This is one of those things that you can kind of change it up depending. So for me and my levels, I very rarely take damage. I know the fight caves quite well when I'm in there, so like I almost never take damage, so I don't carry that many Ceridom and Brews. If you're a lower level and your defense is lower and you're not familiar with the fight caves, you're going to want to replace this with quite a bit more, somewhere between the 6 to 8 range. For me, you know, 3 to 4 is lots. Most often I'll finish with like 2 left over because, like I say, I rarely take damage in the fight caves. Now, in terms of your boosts, I keep a ranging pot, but I prefer the bastions because they also give you higher range and defense. Again, if you're a lower level, you may need 4 pots. 3 should be lots, but you might need a little bit more. And then lastly, your super restores, just make sure you fill up with as many of those as you need. So for me, I go in there, I very rarely take damage, and I pray rigor for like most of the fight caves, so I hammer through super restores. It's gonna kind of come down to your setup and your gear and your levels. So the only thing that you'll need is 2 extra slots for your range switch. You'll only need 1 if you're using a crystal bow, so you can just have a crystal bow in here. But you know, for me, I use the Venator. The reason that I opt to use the Venator is because it hits multiple targets. It's very useful on the healer side of things, especially if they spawn close to Jad and they stack up on him. Usually I can shoot 1 and hit like 2 or 3 more just by default because it bounces off of them. It's not a super viable option because it is about 80 mil right now. It's quite expensive, so a crystal bow is probably going to be your best bet if you're on a budget. But for me, I prefer the Venator. Helps me tag all the healers, minimizes the amount of effort that I have to put into it. Now, inventory setup, like I say, is going to be a recommendation. You do not have to follow this exact inventory setup, but some variation of this will get you through the fight caves. You're going to need, you know, to boost yourself, you're going to need to heal yourself, and you're going to need a ton of prayer. You can also do the math on the prayer to figure out how many prayer points you need, but, I mean, and I don't know if it's that deep, you probably just need a solid, I would say, 8 to 10 at minimum to actually get through it. Realistically, if you're lower prayer, you're probably going to need 12, maybe a little bit more. And you know, for me, because I'm praying rigor and just ripping through it, I just purge through these. I think I usually finish with like 2 or 3 leftovers. So it really comes down to your setup, your gear, and what it is that you're doing, but you'll want some variation of these items here. So there you have it. That is my incredibly detailed breakdown of the intro, requirements, recommendations, some tips and tricks, the gear setups, and the inventory for fight caves. Now, in the next section, we will move into the monsters, talk about how to beat them, what to expect, and give you some examples. And the final section, we will talk about Jad. So we will see you guys in the next section. Thanks for watching. and give you some examples, and the final section we will talk about JAD. So we will see you guys in the next section. Thanks for watching.